welcome to the Production Talk podcast with me, Yarn of mixartist.com.au. In this podcast series, we celebrate the modern way of producing music. We want to talk about all things related to songwriting, recording at home, and music production. So if you produce your music at home, this is the place to be. This is the Production Talk podcast, episode 6. Okay, so in this episode, I'd like to have a little chat about the tool that we use for recording, commonly known as DAW or Digital Audio Workstation. Which one should you get? Which ones might you have already? Is it the right one? Is it the wrong one? Should you go with what your mate says and get rid of everything you own and buy something else? No, probably not. Let's just quickly go through a couple of DAWs that I came across. So I just did a little bit of research and came up with, north of 50 different recording softwares. Some of them I've never even heard of. So just to sum it up quickly, there are a couple of big ones, a couple of small ones, but the ones that I came across right now are Ableton Live, Acid Pro, Ardour, Audacity, Adobe's Audition, bitwixe Studio, Cakewalk, Cubase, Digital Performer, Fruity Loop Studio, GarageBand, Harrison Mixbus, Logic Pro X, Luna, Mixcraft Pro Studio, Nuendo, Pro Tools, Pyro, Reaper, Reason, Samplitude, sicko, Studio One, Traction, and probably quite a few that I didn't find. So here's the thing. Ask yourself whether your DAW is doing what you need it to do. And there's a very good chance it will. Most DAWs are pretty capable of doing almost anything, particularly Ableton, Logic, Pro Tools, Cubase. These are the more common ones that you find in a lot of different studios, and they're all really good with audio recording and MIDI programming. So there's really nothing that will stop you there. We definitely have a couple of special ones in this list. So Pyro, for example, is definitely not for you if you are a home producer. This is a tool for a niche tool for professionals, sometimes mastering engineers. Reaper definitely deserves a mention because it's very reasonably priced and very well spec'd. So a fantastic piece of software. I've worked with Samplitude, which is very capable. Studio One is up and coming. It's been on the rise for the last couple of years, and there's really no end in sight. Luna was released earlier. It's only for UAD users, and I've found that Luna is still a little bit on the light side when it comes to features, but I'm sure this will change over time. Just to give you a bit of a background, some of the older DAWs that definitely deserve a mention are Logic and Cubase. They all started as MIDI list editors a long time ago, probably more than 20 years ago, maybe like 30 years ago. And as MIDI editors, they became more and more capable, and eventually they learned to also do audio recordings. And now they're very good at it. Pro Tools, however, comes from the opposite direction. So Pro Tools was the software while big studios sold all their tape machines and got rid of them, and eventually replaced most old tape machines with a Pro Tools rig in the 90s. That really turned the industry around. At that time, Pro Tools did nothing but audio, and it was really good at it from the beginning on. And in the early days, it couldn't do any MIDI. It then learned a little bit with the release of Pro Tools 7. It got fairly capable. However, it's still considered to be a bit of an underdog when it comes to MIDI. So a lot of people prefer Ableton or Cubase or Logic. However, if you really dig deep, there's a lot of features in Pro Tools as well. So long story short, it is really difficult to find a DAW that is not good. So literally every single DAW that I'm aware of is phenomenal, and having one DAW but not the other is not what keeps you from making a number one hit record. So as long as your DAW works well and does what you need it to do, just stick with this. I reckon there's always another DAW that has this flashy new feature that everybody wants, but to hold your money, if you've got an established workflow in your DAW, just stick with that. There's really nothing wrong about this. Good. Talking about feeling at home in a DAW or digital audio workstation, there's usually a fairly steep learning curve attached to that. And if this is new to you, yes, got yourself a cup of tea. You need extra patience. There will be a couple of moments when you just want to throw the computer out of the window when it drives you up the wall. That is normal in, every time you learn something new. And most of these DAW programs are extremely deep. So looking, for example, at Logic Pro X, it's a software that you can work with for 10 years and you still find new things. It's really, really deep under the hood. Most of them are nowadays. However, that's not necessarily where the money is. It comes down to basic skills. And I have a little list that I would like to talk to you about of key skills that you need to learn and operate to in order to operate your DAW effectively. Yeah, let's get started with point number one. The number one key skill for DAW operation is something really boring. It's file management. Look, this definitely doesn't sound exciting, but you might have been in a situation where you open up a project that you worked on 2 days ago and the window pops up and says, oh, I can't find this or that file. There's an audio file missing. Where is it? Good file management basically means to avoid these situations and just hopefully never end up in one of those situations. And therefore, it's important to understand basics about your DAW's file management. I'm pretty sure there are exceptions, but by my understanding, literally every DAW that I'm aware of records MIDI internally. So if there is a session file, this would contain any MIDI data, therefore also virtual instruments. And that is not stored externally, so it's always attached to your project file, which is really good when it comes to MIDI. However, audio is commonly placed outside. There is often an audio files folder attached to the project, and some DAWs, such as GarageBand or Logic, can also be saved as a package, which seems to be one big bundle that contains everything, including the audio. And if your DAW supports this, it's not a bad workflow to stick with this, because it literally avoids losing audio files. So therefore, that's definitely something to consider or play with or make yourself aware of. The next thing that we need to talk about is technical aspects of audio, going back to sample rate and bit depth. Those two settings are a little bit technical, a little bit boring, but if you get them wrong at the beginning, it can have negative side effects. So it is therefore very important that you familiarize yourself with your DAW and find out where you change these things. And that's where it differs dramatically from one piece of software to the other. Just a simple example is Pro Tools and Ableton in comparison here, where Pro Tools will always ask you to set your sample rate and bit depth upon opening up a new project. So the moment you create it, you have to make that decision, and it's a wise idea to focus on that and just stop for a second, think about what you need to do, choose the right sample rate and the right bit depth, which is probably 24, occasionally 32-bit floating point, but 16-bit is probably not recommendable anymore. Anyway, when it comes to sample rates, there's a longer discussion attached here. However, you literally can't get past the dashboard window in Pro Tools if you want to have a project open. So therefore, you need to make your decision on sample rate and bit depth. And when it comes to sample rate, it's almost set in stone. Changing it later is a little bit of a mission. And to be perfectly honest, it should be. In contrast, Ableton is a little bit more casual, and the beauty of that is if you have an idea in your mind, you just open Ableton and you immediately start tracking, and there's no showstopper in your way. There's no pop-up windows that say, oh, nothing technically. Instead, it's just fairly casual about these things, and the settings for sample rate and bit depth are a little bit hidden. So make yourself aware about this. It's in Ableton in the preferences. under audio, and in there is the sample rate and the bit depth, and it's a very important idea to set those things correctly. So it's one more time, it's the preferences in Ableton, and once you're in there in, excuse me, did I say audio? Yes, that's where it was. So in Ableton, go to the preferences, open up the audio tab, and that's where you set your sample rate. Important, fairly important. Good. Okay, so which sample rate should you choose? Well, look, it's one of these discussions that has been around for decades, and what I learned is that anytime sample rate is discussed somewhere on the internet, any factual discussion turns into a religious war or a big fat shit fight within minutes. People call each other names, yell at each other, swear at each other, capitals come out, lots of swearing. Look, if there's one thing I've learned is that the industry doesn't agree on what the right sample rate is. That's the one thing we can take from it. Let's therefore just think about it technically for a moment. What exactly happens there? With the sample rate, it sets the speed at which your converters sample incoming or outgoing audio. And if we choose one of the standard rates, 48 kilohertz, that means 48,000 times per second, a little sample is taken of the amplitude of the audio and stored in digital form. That's basically what it means. Why do we need to know about this? What practical difference does it make? So let me just explain one thing to you. Not once in the history of the world has a music fan listened to a song and said, that song was recorded at the wrong sample rate, so I will not buy the record. That has never happened, not once. So I think it's one of these discussions that is just a little bit irrelevant. A lot of people keep themselves very, very busy fighting on the internet over sample rates and instead don't find time to produce. So don't be that kind of guy. Just work with the sample rate that you choose and stick with that. This said, there are probably a few technical things that we can point out. One is the higher the sample rate, the more high frequencies you will contain in your recordings, the more high frequencies you will capture. When I say more, I don't mean louder. So in other words, it doesn't make it brighter in audible sense, but it effectively sets the uppest limits, or it sets a limit of the highest frequency that you can record. And that is simply calculated by dividing your sample rate by 2. So in a 48 kilohertz situation, nothing past 24 kilohertz is recorded, and that's effectively all the difference there is. Now this leads to an entire new can of worms. So what's the point of going high sample rate? Look, I don't even want to go there. This is not something that I believe we should spend too much time on. However, if you start a new project, think about what the end product will be. So are you going to make an audio CD, old school? Or are you going to produce a song for video, for post-production, for TV series? Sync music, for example, usually goes along with video. So for anything that's broadcast related, 48 kilohertz seems to be the preferred sample rate. And it's a wise idea to start recording in 48 kilohertz if you want to do the same thing, if you want to produce for post. If you just want to go for music, you can do 44.1. However, what do you do if you want to do both? Let's say you want to produce a song that you would like to release online on Apple Music and SoundCloud and Spotify. And at the same time, you also hope to sell this for sync music licensing to post houses. In this case, I would generally recommend to just stick with the highest common sample rate, in this case 48K. What I would also recommend is to avoid unnecessary sample rate conversion where it's feasible. So let's say if you know the song will be released at 48K, it's maybe not the wisest idea to choose another sample rate to start with. So why don't you just go straight to 48K? Because sample rate conversion by nature is a lossy process. The people who are probably most qualified to do this carefully are usually the mastering engineers who are very experienced with what method to choose to convert sample rate. But in an ideal world, I would always say the sample rate should be converted only once, or not at all. And therefore, if you choose the right sample rate at the top, at the beginning, that's not a bad idea. Okay, good. So that's sample rate and bit depth. The next thing is, where are the recordings stored? And again, some DAWs do it differently than others. Most of them attach an audio files folder to the project and record the files there. However, some other DAWs may need a command like collect all and save at the end of it to get the files from all different places and put them into one directory. I personally prefer the other workflow better. I like to know where my files go as I record rather than trying to patch it up later on. But the only thing that really counts is that you know exactly what your DAW does and how to manage that. So make yourself aware where the audio recordings are actually stored. That's a good place to start. For audio recordings, it's a smart idea to have external hard drives. Solid-state drives don't cost an arm and a leg anymore, so they're warmly recommended for that. They're usually really fast and full of performance, so you usually won't run out of steam. So that's my recommendation, to get yourself a work drive or audio drive, if you want to call it so, where you do all the recordings to. Good. Then there's just one more thing that we need to talk about. There's a good chance that you might record some signals yourself, and then if you want to add things, every once in a while you find yourself dragging files from the Explorer on PC or from the Finder on a Mac into your DAW, just drag and drop. And the question is now, what happens to the audio files? Will they end up in your project directory, or will they remain where they were? So there's another little pitfall here, and again, this differs from project to project. So if in doubt, read the manual, or maybe just do a little experiment and work out for yourself whether you can figure out whether drag and dropped files into your project actually end up within the project or remain where they were. In some DAWs, on import, you get an option to choose either add or copy. When you add, it leaves the audio file where it was, maybe on your desktop or maybe on your mate's external drive, and just play it from there. It will reference the audio file from the original location. Copy usually means that the audio file is imported into your project and a copy is made into the project folder so that you've got your independent copy. In many situations, that is the wiser workflow. However, there are, of course, exceptions where this may not be suitable, so just be aware about this. Just maybe on this note, dragging and dropping into Pro Tools, it literally depends on whether you match the sample rate or not. If the sample rate is a match, it will add and leave the file where it initially was. Or if it's a mismatch, it will actually convert and make a new copy or a new version and put it into your audio files folder. However, in the preferences, there's a setting that will force files to be imported by default. So that is definitely something to consider in Pro Tools that I warmly recommend. Okay, let's sum this point up one more time. So file management is important. You don't want to deal with missing audio files, especially when you're on a tight deadline. That's usually when these things happen. So make yourself aware about where the sample rate and bit depth settings are for your DAW. The recommendation is there to use 24-bit all the time, never 16-bit anymore. That's too old and obsolete. If you want to use 32-bit float, that's fine. Whether you gain something or not is another debate, but okay, nothing to lose over here. When it comes to sample rate, try to match the destination or the target sample rate of your final product. So that you can avoid sample rate conversion, and don't waste your time engaging in sample rate discussions online. That's pretty pointless. Then you need to know where recordings are stored on your computer. Are they with the project? Are they in a common directory? And manage those really well, please. And then the last thing you need to know is what happens when you drag and drop audio files into your DAW. Are they added or copied? This is a point where all the different DAWs are really different, so it's definitely worth checking this out in your own DAW. Okay, good. That concludes file management. Let's move on to the next one, dealing with tracks. So one thing we find in every single DAW is tracks, usually running from left to right along a timeline. And the tracks that you need to be aware of are audio channels. That's what I'm recording to right now, audio tracks, to simply record a microphone or a DI bass into your DAW. Alternatively, you may want to consider MIDI tracks or virtual instrument tracks. They run under different names sometimes. MIDI tracks usually refer to MIDI notes that are recorded from a MIDI keyboard and then routed back out to your DAW to an external sound module like a synthesizer or external sampler. While virtual instrument tracks are pretty similar, they can record MIDI data from an incoming MIDI keyboard. However, the sound modules are inside the computer. They're also known as virtual instruments or VIs. Some people call them just VSTs, although this is a little bit misleading. VST is actually a plugin format. Those three tracks are commonly used, so make yourself aware about what they do, how they look like in your DAW, and choose them accordingly. So audio for anything that you want to record as audio signal, such as microphones or DI signals. MIDI just to record MIDI notes for external sound modules. And virtual instruments or instrument tracks for MIDI notes that trigger internal virtual instrument plugins, such as samplers or synthesizers. One last one that we definitely should mention here, a master. Some DAWs have a master fader built in that's always there. Harrison Mixbus, for example, has a master fader always present. In other DAWs, you may need to create by yourself. A master fader is useful because as you add more files, things can sum up and get louder. And even if everything is recorded clean into the DAW, you need to control the output volume, and that's where a master fader can be useful so that your output converter doesn't clip. Those are the tracks that you need to know of. Aux tracks are sometimes useful, but that's actually more of a mixing thing, so let's not go into too much detail here. Some DAWs have a designated click track or tempo track. That's definitely something to make yourself aware of. No? So a couple of other skills here that relate to tracks is setting the tempo of a song and setting the meter of the song, 4/4 in most situations, but every once in a while we want to do a song in a different time signature. Good. Into this category, I would also add memory locations or markers or whatever they're called, positions. Those are little flags that you can place along the timeline, and one standard use for them is to map out the arrangement, to set a little flag that says intro, another one that says verse 1, or another one that says chorus. That really helps to navigate inside a session and find your way around quickly. Good, that concludes the second subject here that I wanted to talk about. That was tracks. We can now move on to the next one, which is a little bit trickier. It's monitoring. Monitoring is our subject number 3, and it has to do with what you hear when you record through a microphone or maybe a DI signal. There are generally two different possibilities. You can either hear yourself through the DAW or through the interface, and those two monitoring options are both very much valid, and which one you choose should really depend on your piece of gear and your personal computer and your circumstances. So let me explain the differences. Let's say I'm recording some overdubs. Now I programmed the music, it's all recorded, and I now would like to sing across and lay my first vocal take down. The scenario is as follows. All the audio signals come from the computer. However, my vocal is recorded to the computer and then also added back out. So a standard situation would be to do the monitoring through your DAW. And there is a little problem that can come along. It's called latency. Latency is caused by something that we call buffer size, which leads us straight to the next bullet point that I want to talk about. So we'll leave this for a little bit later. The explanation will come. But effectively, a buffer size can be set to optimize your DAW for recording or for mixing. Some DAWs can optimize it to both at the same time, but really this depends on your personal computer. So the first option is to run your monitoring through your DAW. And in this case, you want to find the settings for the buffer size and set this to one of the shortest values you can find. The shortest value is often 32 samples, sometimes 64, and those values usually work quite well. If it's any longer than this, chances are it will manifest itself in the headphone mix as an audible echo, so that you try to sing and you hear yourself actually later, which is a little bit annoying. So therefore, you need to run your computer at a low buffer size. And at the same time, I would recommend to limit plugin use to the absolute bare minimum. You don't want to load your session with lots of fancy mix plugins when you still track at a low buffer size. That's usually when computers start to spit the dummy and misbehave. Okay, so this is option number one. In this case, you don't need to worry too much about monitoring yourself through the audio interface. It's coming through the DAW, and it's definitely a good workflow that works for most situations quite well. This said, the other option is to do the monitoring through your audio interface or your mixer, and it now depends on whether your interface has the capabilities to do this effectively or not, and there are some major differences between the different models. So let me explain what happens in this case. When you track into your DAW, you might even want to consider keeping the channel that you record to muted so that you don't actually hear it coming out of the DAW anymore, but you want to record to it. At the same time, you can use your audio interface and route the incoming signal back to the output. In some audio interfaces, this literally happens in the analog domain. So you might have a little blend control that mixes the input back into the output, and therefore you hear what you sing currently in the outputs as well. Some other audio interfaces, such as the Focusrite Scarletts, for example, or Universal Audio interfaces, they use their own software for that. And there's a little bit of DSP involved and processing that routes the signal again from the input to the output directly. And this allows you to actually run your computer at a high buffer size and maybe even a couple of plugins, while the monitoring happens low latency on the way in. So yeah, you can visualize basically a signal path from the microphone to the audio interface or your preamp, then into your converter. And option A was to run the signal into your DAW, Pro Tools, Ableton, Logic, whatever your weapon of choice is. Then it's going through the DAW and back to the outputs, and from there to your headphones. And if this is your monitoring path, you should be using a low buffer size inside your DAW. Alternatively, you can use option B. In this case, all the playback files would come from your DAW. However, the microphone will be recorded from your mic to the preamp into your computer. And it will literally split at this stage. It will continue to travel to your DAW, and it's recorded to a track, so it's captured. But at the same time, it's split in the interface and directly fed into the outputs so that you can hear yourself without any latency in your headphones. This is often referred to as low latency monitoring or zero latency monitoring or direct monitoring. All of these terms are commonly used. And depending on your audio interface, this might be a very simple process, or it can also get really complicated and techy. So I guess find yourself an audio interface that works quite well in this regard. Okay, that's the monitoring. In most situations, it's a wise idea to choose either one or the other. Which workflow that is for you, I recommend to do a little bit of testing, because you simply need to find out how your computer and your DAW and your audio interface work best together. Yeah, that's a little recommendation here. Good, so let's move on to the fourth bullet point on my to-do list. That's a bit more about the buffer size. So what exactly is a buffer size? Look, a buffer size is effectively a little buffer that your DAW uses to playback audio from. In other words, when you see the playback cursor moving from left to right, it actually reads the audio from the hard drive a little bit ahead of the playhead and puts the data from your hard drive into the RAM and keeps a buffer of audio there. Buffer sizes are usually measured in samples, and that goes back to our sample rate. Effectively, the values such as 64 samples or 256 samples effectively indicates a length of time. It's a duration. And this amount of time is usually then buffered in your computer's RAM, which is really good because that stabilizes the playback. It is necessary because hard drives are particularly dodgy when it comes to playback speed. No, they can reproduce data really quickly, however, rarely very consistently. So the delivery speed of a hard drive constantly fluctuates, goes up and down. And now imagine if this happened to your audio, if you constantly speed up and slow down your audio, everything would sound really wobbly. Note to self, insert a little wobbly sound effect here. And nobody wants to hear that. So the buffer is effectively used to keep the audio running in case the hard drive slows down a little bit. So it constantly speeds up and down, and now the buffer stabilizes the playback. The more load on your computers means the more audio tracks or MIDI tracks, virtual instruments, the more plugins you run, the longer the buffer needs to be. So in other words, when you don't record and when you do edits or mixing, I generally recommend to set a larger buffer size. And in my DAWs, I just literally go to the biggest one available and just don't even think about it anymore. However, in rare occasions, this can cause timing issues for recording automation. That is only for the advanced mix engineers in our audience here. If you track yourself at home, literally don't worry too much about that. Shorter buffer size are good for simple tracking sessions when you just record sounds to your computer and you want to monitor without lots of plugins directly through your DAW, then set your buffer size to a shorter value. And yeah, it is one of the tools that allows you to tune your DAW to work best with your computer together in tandem. Okay, that's the buffer size. Are there any exceptions? Let me just think about this. Yes, there are. There are some recording systems that are DSP based. And the one that just comes to my mind, because I work a lot with those, is called an HTX system from Avid, from Pro Tools. And this system basically does a lot of the audio routing without involving this CPU, which changes everything in some ways and can guarantee a very, very low latency, literally inaudible, even when plugins are unused. But generally speaking, my suggestion would be to either decide for a high buffer size and then use a few plugins to your liking, or choose a low buffer size if you want to monitor through your DAW, and then make sure not to use many plugins at all. So for tracking, keep your buffer size short, and for mixing, make it longer. Good, this was bullet point number 4. Let's move on to the next one on my list. The fifth and second last one, it's recording basics. Well, a lot of the things are self-explanatory. Usually on each track you find a little red button that you can press to record arm a channel or track. And then in your transport window you might have a big red button that starts the actual recording process, and then you can select which tracks you record to by clicking the record arm button on each track. I would say this is pretty much consistent across all the DAWs. They're usually red and they're often all called record arm, and then in contrast the record button in the transport window. However, this may differ from DAW to DAW slightly. So no big surprise over here. However, every DAW that I'm aware of has a key command to commence recording, and that's definitely one that I would suggest you look up and maybe write down, put a little sheet right next to your computer, because that saves you a lot of time eventually when you do a lot of recordings. So Shift R, for example, in my Harrison Mixbus, or 3 in the numeric keypad in my Pro Tools rig, and Logic is different again. But whatever it is in your DAW, work out the recording key command. That is one of the most basic skills. Good. I'm a big fan of recording full takes with musicians, if that works to their strength, of course. But I often find myself doing 2 or 3 vocal takes, and I try not to go into too many takes at all. However, if I then feel like, there was one good take, but there's a little section that could be a little bit better, we would then go into punch-in recording. Punch-in recordings are generally done when you're already done with the take, and then you just want to improve one little section. In most DAWs, this is done by simply placing the cursor somewhere, literally just before the odd note or bum note that you didn't like. And then you set yourself something by the name of pre-roll time. And the pre-roll time is used to play back the audio leading up to the punch-in point, so that if you just hit record, it would be a little bit hard to get into the timing straight away. But with the pre-roll time, you can listen to, let's say, 3 or 4 bars of audio leading up to the point to get into the groove. And then from the punch-in point, whether you place the cursor, it would then jump into the recording. This is actually something that is much easier when you do your DAW monitoring with a low buffer size instead of interface monitoring. However, I guess, there's more than one way to do it, so let's just be open-minded here. But it's a very useful little recording technique where you set yourself a pre-roll time. Let's say 2 bars usually works well, 4 bars works well, and place the cursor where you want to start recording. Then place the 4 bars leading up back so you can hear what you did before, let's say your old vocal take. And then once you hit the punch point, it goes into recording and starts tracking. So that gives you a couple of bars to get into the groove, sing along, and then patch up a certain word that didn't come out the right way in the first place. The same can happen for the punch out points. So you can literally program a punch in and a punch out. If, let's say, there's only one line that you would like to redo, inside a verse, there's maybe just a couple of words, you can highlight those. That's usually done with a highlighted area, sometimes along the timeline, sometimes across the audio. That depends on your DAW. And then you can also set yourself a post-roll time so you jumps back into the old take so you can hear the transition really well. And that's definitely a good recording technique to learn and familiarize yourself in your own DAW how this is best done. So a few things to look up: punch in recording, punch in or punch out points, and setting pre and post roll times. This is definitely a little trick that makes it much, much easier to record. Good. That leads me to the last point of the day: take management and compiling. So let's be perfectly honest, it's very rare that musicians nail the very first take. Although these musicians are around, but that's definitely not common. And a lot of musicians are used to doing many takes, and there's really nothing bad about it. So let's just move on and make our peace with that. It's just the way it is, and that's perfectly fine. So what's the best way to manage takes? Let's say you have a musician who would like to record a few takes. In this case, you could, for example, do it the old school way and now move the first take and drag it over to the right-hand side and make some more space. But that makes it really hard to compare takes. So there's usually better methods. In some DAWs, they're known as playlist or takes in others. And that allows you to record more than one take and stack them up on the same channel along the same place along the timeline, and then alternate between them. So that is a really good feature, because now when you do, let's say, 3 vocal takes, you might find that the first one was a warm-up take, but you really nailed the outro. But the choruses were really good in the second take, and the verses were really good in the third take. Now you've got a little puzzle here, and this is called compiling, or comping in short, where you choose bits and pieces of each take and patch them together into one compiled take, or golden take, as some people call it. And when it comes to compiling, there are definitely differences between the different DAWs. So maybe just read up on takes management and compiling for your DAW. In Pro Tools, there's some very nice features that I like a lot. Logic is also very good. It makes it super intuitive. It crossfades for you automatically. Other DAWs handle it differently. So just learn these features for your own DAW. Once you're in the compiling process, you will often find that you need to learn the tools of your DAW. Often there's a little bit of trimming and fading involved. That's a very common workflow. You also may learn how to split clips or edit clips, sometimes called separate. That differs from DAW to DAW again. But basic editing techniques are definitely something that's worth learning, because you can actually save a lot of money if you clean up your takes all by yourself. Often you find that at the beginning of a song, there's a lot of, what appears to be silence at first, but if you zoom in or listen very carefully, you can hear handling noises, people just leading up to the counter might, handle the guitar or clear their throat or breathing through the microphones. And these things literally pile up and make themselves audible in the mix. So if you can just trim off the beginnings and just apply short fades at the beginning, and now also inspect the end of the song and just wait for everybody to allow the last note to sustain nicely, then find the right place to chop it off and apply a nice smooth fade at the end. That's generally a good workflow. Good. Okay, so now we sum it up one more time. File management was the first one, knowing where your audio files are and where they should go. And then the next one was learning your tracks, MIDI, virtual instruments, audio, and maybe even master tracks. And then we needed to learn about the monitoring through your DAW or through the interface. In this regard, we came across the buffer size, what it is and what it ain't. And then we spoke about a couple of recording basics, as in standard recording techniques, punch in and punch out with pre and post roll. There's also loop recording, which I forgot to mention, by the way. This can be an interesting technique sometimes. It's often used in ADR and sound for picture or post-production. However, it can also be very useful for musicians sometimes. And the last step was then take management and compiling. And those basic skills are definitely worth investing a little bit of time in. YouTube is a fantastic place to find tutorial videos. However, I sometimes find that it's really hard to get to the good stuff, because among the hundreds of videos, you also find actually a lot that I personally would not recommend, or sometimes people actually say wrong things in those videos. So take everything you see there with a pinch of salt. Get used to opening up the PDF manual of your DAW and do a bullet point search. Just search for something like punch in and find your answers this way. That's also definitely a good thing. And if you want to learn more about your DAW and you don't want to trust YouTube, you can look for official training courses. So some developers such as Avid actually offer their own training courses. I know because I am actually an Avid certified Pro Tools trainer and have helped a lot of people overcoming the initial bump and hurdle. Apple does the same thing. There are lots of training courses for Ableton, and there's a lot of good stuff that may be worth investing in, but that obviously depends on you. If you prefer to just do it in your own time, also check out LinkedIn Learning, which used to be known as lynda.com. But under LinkedIn Learning, there are a lot of different tutorial videos that are found to be of generally very high quality, with very few exceptions. But most of the stuff that is said there is actually super good, very valid, and definitely worth learning. So for most major DAWs, there are extensive long tutorial videos that are definitely worth checking out. And just as we finish this episode up, I would like to just tell you about a little special that I just put into the show notes of this episode. If you have some music ready and you need some help with that, you can click the link in the show notes and apply for a free test mix. And the way it works is you just give me some files, I'll have a listen if I can take it on. I'm pretty busy, so this is a limited offer, of course. I can't take on every single song, but if I find the time, I will have a go at mixing your work. I'll give you half a song back to have a quick listen, and you can then decide to go ahead or move on. That's perfectly fine. No questions asked, no risk, no obligations. This is a very special offer that is now available to podcast subscribers. As a little thank you for tuning in with me. I really appreciate that. Go to the show notes, click the link to apply for a free test mix. Speak soon. Okay, good. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I'm sure there are lots of questions. At a later stage, we might be able to go into more technical details and go into more advanced things. But for now, this should cover most of the basics that you need to record yourself at home, or your band, or your mates, and I wish you all the best with that. Let me know if you've got any questions. You can always reach out to me on social media via mixartist.com.au on my website. And I would also appreciate if you could please give my podcast a 5-star rating, because this will really help me to get more interview partners attracted to this podcast. And I really appreciate you hanging out with me for this long. Have a great week, and we'll see you then. Bye for now.